Welcome to this special edition of My Life. I want to introduce you to a good friend of mine, a fellow by the name of Tom Deluca. I want to tell you a couple things about him first. During the last couple weeks, Tom and I have been on the Springfield Township Board of Review. That's where taxpayers come in and complain about their property taxes if they go up too much. Well, they didn't go up that much, so we didn't have many complainers. What we did have was a lot of time because legally we had to be there. And during that time, I had the pleasure of talking to Tom about some of the remarkable things he's done in his life. It isn't very often you meet a Renaissance man, but I think Tom qualifies as one. First of all, he was the son of Italian immigrants who started school not knowing any English and had to fight that battle. He finally went through college. He found a career with the state of Michigan as an executive in the education department. And while he was doing that, he managed to learn how to build violins, violas, and cellos, among other things. He's restoring a 1938 Chris Craft. He's got an energy-efficient home, a geothermal home. It'd probably be easier to tell you some of the things Tom doesn't do or hasn't been involved with. But I'm glad you've joined us for this special edition. Tom, thank you so much for being on the program. It's great to have you here.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to be with you.
You have a beautiful home here. We're so glad to be here. I'd like to start by talking about your childhood. Tell us a little bit. Okay, so your dad and mom came from Italy.
Yeah, they actually emigrated to Canada in, what was it, 1927, I guess it was, and worked on Pelee Island doing the vineyards at Vinvilla on Pelee Island, and then over the years gravitated, moved over onto the mainland of Ontario, worked their way down to Windsor, and then actually my dad worked on the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel for one day, and when he came out after that first day, he said he was never going back down there again. And then when Henry Ford was offering $5 a day, that prompted the move over to Detroit. And
that was a lot more then than it is now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I was born in 1938, and my parents lived with my grandparents. My grandparents spoke no English at all. My mother spoke, she actually went through the 10th grade and was fluent and spoke both English and Italian without an accent in either one. My father spoke English, but with a obviously heavy Italian accent. But as a child, growing up in that home environment and in a neighborhood that was primarily Italian, where all the kids were Italian, I spoke primarily Italian until
this was down in Detroit?
Yes, this was in
Whereabouts?
Detroit. Oh, it was around, the first street I lived on was England Street, which was around Joseph Campbell's 6 Mile Road. And I went to, what was it, Davison Elementary School, I believe it was. And I really didn't begin speaking English until I started school. Obviously, I had to at that point. And unfortunately, it was during the Second World War. And I remember going home crying to my mother and telling her that I didn't know Mussolini, he didn't live on my street, and I never played with him. And I don't know why the kids were so angry with me for being one of Mussolini's boys. So anyhow, gradually I not only, left that Italian accent, but boy, I sure became English in my accent.
But you were fighting a battle that a lot of immigrants fought. You weren't technically an immigrant yourself.
No.
But I know my mother and father-in-law came from Belgium, went through the same thing, spoke no English when they got here. Did your friends help you out, or did they make fun of you when you're going through all that?
Well, the kids on the block were mostly Italian kids, and so we were all dealing with the same stuff. And in school, actually what happened, I think this was in the second grade or whatever it was, I don't remember, but we had to stand up and introduce ourselves the first day of class. And when it got my turn, I stood up and introduced myself, and the teacher said, "Oh, Deluca, you must be French." And the light went on. they don't pick on the French kids. So I became French after that.
Sounds good to me, right? Parlez-vous français?
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. So it was kind of an interesting experience growing up in that time. Actually, you know, I'm really, I guess, one of the last generations that remembers. You know, I was alive, although very young during the Second World War. There aren't too many around any longer that actually remember that whole experience. Yeah, yeah, that was a different time in history.
What are some of your best memories of growing up in Detroit in that Italian family situation?
Oh, it's the closeness of the family. It was just, you know, everybody lived, you know, most of the family lived within walking distance. Every Sunday, it was Sunday dinner, rotated through different members of the family. It was just a bond that you just don't see any longer. It was just a closeness that is just indescribable. Yeah.
So if I asked you what you did for fun as a kid, it was probably something that was family related, right?
Well, actually, you know, we played out in the streets and in the alleys with all the kids. You know, kick the can and hide go seek and, you know, all the games. You know, there were obviously nothing electronic. There was nothing that, so you just played with each other all the time, and it was always out in the street or in the alley, and you just played all kinds of games. It was a different time.
And that was during the war, as you said, so
Yeah.
you probably had limitations on certain things.
Oh, absolutely. I remember our backyard of our home. There was no grass. It was all planted with edible produce, and it was just. I remember. I remember I would have to go out with my shovel and fight with the other kids in the street for the horse manure.
To use for?
To fertilize the stuff in the backyard that was being grown. So, you know, it was like a little miniature farm, you know, a 10-foot square or whatever it was, you know, 20-foot square farm.
Remember, this was like in the early 1940s,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, yeah,
So there
'cause-
really weren't that many horses on the street, but there were a few. But what I'm getting at is your supply was rather limited.
Oh, well, listen, the milk wagon was drawn by a horse. The vegetable wagon was drawn by a horse. You know, there was a lot of horse-drawn activity at that. And then in the alley, there was the sheeny man. And the sheeny man was the person, again, horse-drawn wagon, that picked up the trash. The
junk man.
The junk man. You know, so there were horse-drawn
That's
vehicles.
what Kirk Douglas's dad did.
Is that right?
Yeah. In
Well,
fact,
darn.
actually, he was a rag man. That's
Well,
what he
there you
called
go.
it. And I
Yeah,
believe the
yeah.
book that Kirk wrote was The Rag Man's Son.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
yeah.
anyway, so then, where did you go to high school in Detroit?
Pershing High School.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a sister. She's 6 years younger than me, and she lives about an hour away. And when I went to high school, I'd always had a difficult time in school because I had a hard time, even though I learned English very quickly, I had a difficult time learning to read. I went through high school in the vocational program. And that's the program where they used to joke where the boys had their brains in their fingers, not in their head. And so I was trained as a machine operator and a draftsman, and actually was working, got my job, first job as, I chose drafting as opposed to machine operator, and worked as a tool and die designer for several years before I decided to go to college and become an engineer. And when I applied for college, I of course was rejected because my high school.
But let's back up and talk about that some more. You're not a stupid person. You've got a lot of mental skill.
Yeah.
So you ended up going into this particular program in high school. Did that have something to do with your you know, the language thing, or what do you
Not,
think?
not the well, kind of in a roundabout way, because I just had a terrible time in school. I had a terrible time reading. I would have probably been diagnosed as dyslexic or whatever,
Okay.
or learning disabled, because I just had a very hard time. It wasn't actually until I can remember the day in college when I could read a sentence and not the words, because up to that point I was reading words and not the sentence, and it just took me forever. And as a kid, I used to walk around with a pad and pencil, and I would write all the words down that I didn't know, and then at night I would go home and study the dictionary. And ironically, many years later, I was in a administrative meeting in the State Department, and I overheard someone comment about that Deluca. God, he's got a vocabulary that just won't end. And I had to just chuckle to myself, thinking, how many of you
If
had to
you
study
only
the
knew.
dictionary?
Was was there any special person who helped you through all that?
Not really. I was basically on my own in that account. I had a lot of friends, but in terms of making the adaptation and adjustment to life, that was just, I did what was expected. I chose the course in high school where I was the most comfortable, and that was working with my hands, becoming a machine operator and a draftsman. And
That draftsman kind of introduced you to a new way of life in a way, didn't it?
oh, absolutely. I worked as a cartographer. I drew maps. I worked as an architectural draftsman.
And this was before college. This was after high
Yes,
school.
yes, and of course tool and die design in Detroit. That was the big thing. Hell, I was making more money than my father, who was a factory worker, because of the skilled trade that I had as a designer.
Okay.
And but I realized that one day what happened was I was asked by the room boss to go see the owner of the shop. And that's not uncommon, because oftentimes after you finished a project, everybody was let go, and then you worked in another project in another company next week. But they used to keep a couple of workers because some of the work would come back from the automotive companies to be modified. So I figured he just wanted me to come back next week to do the modification.
Right.
Well, he offered me a full-time job. And I realized at that moment that if I accepted that, because I was working the job shops, which was kind of a rotating system.
Yeah. Now we're probably talking what, late 1950s here?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. That if I accepted that, this would be my life forever, because I would never, ever be able to move up to a management position, because those guys were all engineers.
Right.
And that's what prompted me to apply to college.
So how long had you worked after high school before making the college decision?
A couple of years. And of course, I applied to the University of Detroit, and they rejected me because of my high school credentials were simply, inadequate. So what I did was I went to Highland Park Community College for a year, did all my high school all over again, and then reapplied.
Wow.
And I was accepted at that point then. So, and then I switched from engineering to, actually my degrees are in psychology. I got interested in human behavior, and I worked in corrections for a while. And
So you had to, in essence, take high school all over again at
Yeah.
Highland Park Community College,
Right.
in order to get into college. And where did you start college at after that?
University of Detroit.
University of Detroit. You finally broke the barrier and got into the University of Detroit.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
So what was your course of study when you first?
Well, I started off in engineering, but then switched over to psychology because of my interest in human behavior. I was doing some volunteer work with delinquent kids, and just got kind of fascinated by what prompted aberrant behavior. And so then I switched over into psychology and got my bachelor and my master's degree in psychology.
So you were well into psychology then.
Yes, yeah. I actually started my PhD at the University of Michigan, but I never completed. I never completed it because at that time I was very much involved with the Department of Corrections. I was working as a corrections officer.
Okay, how did you get from psychology to the Department of Corrections?
Well, if you had an MSW or an MA in social work or psychology, you qualified for a position in corrections. But I found that it actually was getting to be a bit depressing, seeing that side of life so intently. And it just happened quite accidentally. I had a friend, a professional friend, who worked for the State Department of Education vocational rehabilitation program, and they were hiring. So he said, hey, why don't you come work for us, which I did. And so I shifted from corrections to vocational rehabilitation and education. And that's putting disabled people back together again,
right,
and then putting them back into the labor market. And over relatively, with time, I became a district manager in an administrative position.
So would this have been during the early 60s that you went to work for the state?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the mid-60s.
Okay,
yeah.
And you ended up retiring from there, did you?
Yes, yeah, I retired after 30 years or whatever it was. So, by that time, I had my violin avocational interests really developing, and because I'd always been a woodworker.
So you're going to put your shop skills to work?
Yes, yeah.
And there's a very interesting story. I believe as you were working for the state, you were involved with the program for the deaf. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
We're going to talk more about that. We're out of time. We're going to conclude this segment right now, but when we come back, we're going to pick up with that.
Yes,
we'll be right
indeed.
back. Tom, I think what you told me before was you were in charge of a program involving the deaf. Is that correct, with the state of Michigan?
Correct. I wasn't personally involved with them, but I had staff that worked with the deaf. And I had seen an article in the paper about a deaf violin maker in the Metro Detroit area.
Had you had any thoughts of building violins up until this point?
No, not at all. I play a lot of instruments. I started off like all good Italian boys with the accordion, and then went to the mandolin. And the one instrument that I really loved, but just frustrated me no end, was the violin. When I was 20 years old, I went into a pawn shop and I put a $20 bill on the counter. And I asked the pawnbroker for a violin, and he turned around. There's a whole row of violin cases on the shelf, and he pulls one down, opens it up, and we both agreed there was a violin in there. So he took the $20 bill, I took the violin.
You said, I want the red one.
Yeah, but playing the violin was not at all like playing the mandolin, even though the fingering is the same. Obviously, the technique is massively different. So people ask me, well, you make violins, do you play? And I say, well, yes, of course I do, but you don't want to hear me.
Yeah.
So that was just a source of massive frustration that I could never learn the violin, the instrument I loved the most. I just couldn't master the bowing and the fingering without the frets on the fingerboard.
Okay, so you mentioned you read about this
Yeah.
violinist luthier
Yeah.
who was deaf.
Yeah, his name is Ben Harrison. Had Harrison Violins in Berkeley, Michigan, and and of course, I had a staff program that dealt with the deaf.
And this would have been roughly 1960. What?
Well, this would have been in the 80s.
Okay, the 1980s.
Yeah, this would have been in the 1980s.
All right.
And I had always maintained, an interest in woodworking, whether it was antique furniture, wooden boats, whatever. I always enjoyed woodworking. But this was in the mid '80s that my wife approached me. She's a violinist, and said that her fiddle needed some repair.
Now, this was before she was your wife, wasn't it? Weren't you dating at this point?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Is this how you met your wife, or?
Well, it was interesting. I met her because I had an apartment. I lived in Walled Lake. I had an apartment that I rented. And it was a beautiful piece of property. And it had a boathouse, and it was involved.
You were right on Walled Lake, weren't you?
Yes, right on the lake at the end of the peninsula there. And but I never rented to women because I traveled a lot and I was gone a lot. And the house needed to be maintained. So, and of course, you couldn't count on a woman to maintain your house.
Be careful how you say this.
So I always made sure that I rented to men that I felt comfortable could run the place in my absence. So if a woman answered the ad for renting the apartment, I would just blow her away, Well, for whatever reason, to this day, I don't know why. I picked up the phone, I was renting the apartment, and it was a female voice. And I agreed to interview her.
She just sounded right.
I don't know why I agreed to interview her. Well, wouldn't you know it? She wanted an apartment on a lake because she had just bought a sailboat and wanted to learn how to sail. I was a sailing instructor. She was a violinist. I was a frustrated violin player. So wouldn't you know it, between sailing and violin, it was a natural bond. So there you go. God, and to this day,
So was it during that time that she approached you about fixing her violin?
Yes, yeah. She approached me because she could, I was obviously a woodworker, very mechanical and so on. And so she wanted me to fix her fiddle. And I said, well, yeah, I can do that.
It just so happens.
And I went to the library and I got some books on violin maintenance and repair, and realized very quickly how complicated this instrument was.
So at that point, you were familiar with shop and building some things,
but not musical
you've never
instruments.
looked at building a violin before.
No, nor any musical instrument. Well, then I got to thinking, well, Ben Harrison is a deaf man who makes violins. How fascinating. So I went over and introduced myself to him, and he and I got along really well. Ben lost his hearing in the Second World War. He was originally from Tennessee, and as a young man prior to the war, he was a fiddler, and he had made a couple violins. And his goal in life was to be a fiddler and a violin maker. Well, he lost his hearing in the war, and upon his discharge, the GI Bill, got his degree in engineering, and went to work for Chrysler here in Detroit.
And he was deaf at that time?
He was deaf at the time. Never lost his love for the violin, and taught himself how to tune the plates, and we'll get into this later, by feeling the vibration of the plates by putting a tuning fork on it. Normally, plates are tuned by what's called a tap tone, where you hold the plate in a certain manner and you tap it, and you listen for a resonance. Well, obviously, he couldn't do that. So he could hold it in a certain way, and with a tuning fork, he could feel the vibration. And I just found that so fascinating. It was just intriguing. And to make a long story short, I ended up doing a 5-year apprenticeship with him. And,
but that didn't happen easily, did it?
Oh, well, no, I can give you, it's rather comical, the details on how it did happen. So I approached Ben, and after we had met and chatted, and we really hit it off well, and I said, well, Ben, I've got one of my wife's fiddles, and it needs repair. Can you kind of walk me through repairing it? And he smiles at me, and he says, no. I was quite taken back by that. And he says, you shouldn't be fooling around with this instrument unless you understand how it's made. And I said, oh, well, that makes sense. Can you teach me how to make one? And he smiles at me and he says, no. And again, I was absolutely amazed, because by this time we had known each other for some time. I'd stopped by his shop and chatted with him. And I was quite surprised by that. So I decided, well, okay.
So you were trying to schmooze him into the right direction all this time.
Right. So I bought all the materials I need to make the violin from him, all the raw wood and everything. And I had the books at home, so I would start making this violin. And being the clever fellow that I am, every week I would go by the shop and I'd show him what I was doing. And of course, he couldn't just not say anything. He would have to comment on this, that, and the other thing. Well, we got to be very close, Kay and I and Ben and Mary and his wife. And one Sunday we were having dinner at Ben's house. And after dinner, the girls had cleaned the table off. And on very complicated issues, we would write. Normally we could speak, he could read my lips very well. But on really complicated issues, we would have to write. So he was writing something. He put the pen down and looked at me, smiled, and said, well, I guess if I'm not teaching you, nobody is. The reason he had rejected my application, and I've had the same experience when people have come to me and said, hey, Tom, can you teach me to make a violin? But I don't play that game that Ben played with me. I ask, well, how long do you want to study with me? Oh, maybe 6-8 weeks. Well, Ben had had that same experience. He'd had his shop for a long time. And he knew that most people wouldn't stay. They don't last the course.
Right.
And so he was testing me to see whether or not my commitment was there.
Okay.
And when he realized my commitment was there, he says, okay, I'm taking you on.
All right. We're going to take a break, but we're going to come right back.
Hi, everybody. I'm Terry Stiles.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Service, and I'm the producer of Our Community Access. Terry and I started our show 8 years ago to bring our community into your living rooms.
Our Community Access is a show born from the rich diversity of our community, and we want to brag about it and the people creating that diversity.
Over the years, we've been from fox hunts to beekeeping and right in your own backyard.
We welcome new businesses, chamber fashion, senior hobbies, class reunions, and much, much more.
We've covered all our celebrations from Leonard Strawberry Festival to our premier Lone Ranger Parade.
But there's still more avenues that we plan on going on.
So watch Our Community Access at 9:30 and 5:30 every day, and you have a great, great week.
You know, we have so much more we can talk about, Tom. We could probably stay here for a couple hours.
Right.
But I really do want the folks to get a look at your shop, and I want to see
Absolutely.
it myself because I haven't seen it yet.
Yep.
So why don't we take a walk into your workshop, and you can talk us through some of the stuff that you're doing out there.
You
okay?
got it.
All right, let's go.
Let's go.
As you can tell, Tom Deluca has quite a story to tell. So much so that we couldn't all fit it into one episode. Next episode, we're going to go into Tom's workshop and have a look at how he makes the violins. Stay tuned. You're watching OCTV, Oxford Community Television, serving Oxford, Addison Township, and the village of Leonard.